Welcome to Connecting to Admired Leadership, where twice a month we explore the behaviors and routines that make great leaders extraordinary. I'm Wes Bender, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting some of our firm's partners, coaches, and clients to discuss leadership in ways you won't hear anywhere else. Let's dive into this episode and make people and situations better together.
So for those of you who have been here a lot and collecting your frequent flyer miles of these webinars, you will have noticed that I am not Wes. My name is Mallory Stacy. I'm filling in for Wes today, getting to host Ben as we have this conversation. I'm a managing director at CRA Admired Leadership. And my goal for today is for us to really deep dive into this field note that hopefully you have all read, memorized, and thought deeply about over the last couple of weeks. And we're just going to try to bring it to life, give you a way to make it more actionable, practical, and answer some of the questions that have already been submitted. With me today, not Wes, but Ben. Ben is a partner in Admired Leadership. He's been on, I think, Ben, we said at least 5 of these already. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so he knows what he's doing. He's got this. He doesn't even need me. And I will tell you that as a partner at the firm, something I really admire about Ben, which then took me to deep dive on my own values, is that Ben is objectively one of our busiest members and team members in the organization. And yet Ben is somebody who, if you have a question, want to pick his brain, get some insider perspective, he is the first person to pick up the phone, answer it, somehow make 5 minutes in the day when we know he doesn't have 5 minutes. So Ben, I am honored and excited to have you here. If there's anything else you want to introduce about yourself or your goals from today?
Just appreciate the opportunity to be here, and Mallory, thanks for the kind words. Just want to make the conversation as actionable and practical as possible. So by all means, if folks have questions or nuances to the conversation as we go, don't be afraid to chime in, type it in the chat, submit the question, whatever's easiest, and we'll get to as many as we can.
And as always, we want to know who's joining us. So if you can take a moment into the webinar chat to just type in your name, where you're from, say a quick hi, that would be great just to know who's with us. And as you are all doing that, I'm going to give you a quick recap of the field note just in case and you haven't read it and to jog your memory. The essence of this field note was really, if you ask somebody to tell you their values, they're just going to give you a laundry list of these are all of the things that are virtues that I strive for. And so when you're really trying to get to the root of it, it's better to ask who you admire because it cuts all of the noise. Another key takeaway is that we really want to strive for only 2 to 3 values, not a long list of virtues, because it's hard to stick to them. And if we're going to make decisions, if we're going to action on them, then we really need to be able to focus on just a core key amount. And finally, most leaders, they can articulate what they're against, but it's much harder to take that positive spin and articulate what you stand for. So Ben, I feel like our goal as coaches and in this conversation is, can we get to that? Can we help people figure out what are the things that you stand for? That's fair. So out the gate, I think the word values and virtue is key to define. Like, what is a value? So Ben, how do you think about values versus a virtue?
Great question. Language matters. I think when we think about values, ideally we want to think about things that are specific and actionable and behavioral. A lot of times when you'll ask either an organization or individuals what they value, they'll tend to list what you describe as virtue. So some people might call them principles, but they'll say things like integrity or diversity or fairness, and all of those are great, but they're also abstractions in many ways. And when we really think about values as ways to actually guide our actions and decision making, they need to be a little bit more kind of specific and practical in terms of what they are. So as an example, if I say, I value inclusion. Well, what does that actually mean? That might mean how I assemble and curate project teams. or that might mean how I ask questions in a conversation to make sure that every voice is heard. So I feel like virtues are sort of that aspirational list of sort of descriptors, but really what we want to strive for are what we think about as values, those practical kind of manifestations and expressions that actually show up in how we lead day to day.
Thank you for the level setting from the communication expert. Do you ask this question with clients, with teams?
It depends on the context. So, if an organization is rolling out a new strategy, or if they've got some kind of cultural priorities or things that they're looking to roll out, and some might even be as explicit and overt as launching a new set of values. I think in those instances, it can be a helpful tool to create alignment, either among a team or a leadership group, to force some specificity. Things are different when you have to write them down. It creates a degree of kind of alignment and specificity that we're always striving for. So in those contexts, sometimes I'll ask the question. In individual coaching conversations, I may not use that exact language, but I might ask questions like, what guides your decision making, or what primary factors do you look at when you're allocating resources, or something like that. Those are sort of different ways to kind of get at the same thing, but again, through that lens more of practicality, as opposed to, usually if you just ask somebody, they'll just rattle off a few things, which isn't necessarily helpful.
Yeah. And it's interesting. When I was thinking about this one, I feel like I use it much more in a dialogue conversation to kick it off, to your point, to ground, but also start thinking, okay, whose style do you admire? And then you pull out a name and you say, okay, well, what elements of that person do you like in their communication style, or what elements of how they're showing up do you like? And maybe with some of our specific behaviors, but not as much on that macro level. How do we get to our core values and drive from there? Do you feel like when you use it with teams, how do you then pull on those values to help them make the decision or figure out what to do next? Or what do you do once you've gotten to that point with them?
Yeah, again, context really drives it. But a lot of times, if you just sort of follow the energy of the conversation, you can start to kind of pull some threads and get a little bit more specific and probe on things that sort of moves people to a little bit more specificity. So sometimes we'll ask questions like, what are you funding, right? When you're allocating resources like that, it's a big indication of what's important. Or what are the criteria that you use to promote senior talent, right? Like, so you're not asking what the value is it per se, but you're asking more about the indicators and the actual expressions of those values, which can be a really fruitful place to help sort of identify and codify those. So part of it is just asking really good questions and sort of following the energy of the dialogue. One thing I like to do is, kind of being from the outside, we also have the luxury of sort of being able to observe in kind of that third party context. So sometimes what I'll do is say, hey, we had this conversation for 90 minutes. Here are the 3 or 4 things that jumped out to me that it appears are really important to you. Are those right? Sometimes it's a lot easier for somebody to sort of observe it and then articulate it and sort of validate or gut check it, as opposed to people that are living in it every day, trying to make sense of it and articulate it and define it. So I think sometimes there's power in that objectivity too.
How do you weed out then like the team values and what the team cares about versus the individual? Because everybody's coming into that team with their viewpoint, their values, or even their laundry list of virtues. And then as a team, we have to align on what we care about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not easy to do. I think, again, it sort of depends on the outcome that they're trying to drive, but usually in group conversations, I'll make it less about the people and more about sort of the organization as the entity. So even the language that we use. So a lot of inclusive language. What do we value? What's important to us? How do we want to be described? What does the organization tell us is important? Who do we need to be sort of as a collective? So I think the way that you pose the questions matters, to sort of keep the delineation between what might be individual values versus what might be more collective values. I find anyway, and this might just be my own kind of work, I tend to do a lot more of those group conversations as opposed to the individual ones. Maybe just the nature of the work that I tend to do most.
Yeah, I mean, I actually arguably think that's a really interesting lens because then you get the conflict in the room where somebody might personally value one thing so much and somebody else values something else. How do you figure out the balance either within the individual or the team of a look, I really value excellence. Well, and so that takes time and quality and information, and I value responsiveness. How do you
Mhm.
deal with those two?
Yeah, it's another great question. I feel like pretty much every value can be in tension with another value. Like, and it's not about one wins as much as it is how do they coexist in a way that aligns with the organization's strategy. Like to me, the great equalizer is the organizational vision and strategy, right? Like we may have individual preferences, but at the end of the day, like what does the organization need from us? And then how do we use that to sort of evaluate? And when there are areas of tension, you mentioned excellence and responsiveness. You could also say like inclusion and efficiency might tend to be in tension, right? Running an inclusive process where everybody has a voice and can weigh in versus, getting things done quickly and efficiently. One's not right, one's not wrong. They're both valid. The question is like when they are in tension like that, which one's going to win or which one are we going to favor over the others? And the criteria shouldn't be personal preference as much it should be, and I'm talking in a group context here. It should be what does the organization need and what's going to get us closer to our strategy and align with those organizational goals as opposed to personal agendas.
Obviously, it makes sense that we would want to bring people into our organization who have similar values or values can align to fit in well with the team, unless you disagree with that. Putting a stake in the line there.
No, I think generally that makes sense. I mean, we shouldn't all be the same. We don't all have to have the exact same values, but if there are shared ones at the organizational level, I think it's certainly worth kind of screening and evaluating people's sort of predisposition to those.
Yeah, I think where this comes into play too, then is around the talent space. How are we hiring people, bringing them into our teams, thinking about how we build a team within an organization with the alignment of values, which is probably
Mhm.
where those cookie cutter questions no longer make sense anymore, which I know we do some of that work. How do you play with that? Do you think about talent even on your own team as you build out our Chicago office?
Yeah. Again, it's not that we need everybody to be the same as much as we need people to be in support of some shared and common values. So it starts with knowing what they are, right? And that's kind of what we talked a little bit about previously. And a way to understand what they are and be able to distill and articulate and prioritize them, as the field note suggests, is one measure is what do you admire in other people? Right. So it's really hard to put that lens on yourself right out of the gate and say, here's everything that I value. But a great indicator is discerning what people value or admire in others as a bit of a starting point, because there's usually some congruence there, consciously or subconsciously, around, if I admire it, then chances are it's important to me. So I think it kind of starts there. In terms of talent selection, you can gauge people's self-awareness and actually ask them, right? Like what would you say your values are? Or one that I love to ask in our firm, especially if I'm later in the process, is based on the conversations that you've had so far, what are two or three things that you've observed that you think we value?
Mhm.
It gives you a sense of, are people paying attention? Are one, it's also a gauge, inwardly to say like, are we actually presenting in a way that is consistent with what we actually value? Like ideally we'd be looking for congruence there. And you can also ask people, like one of our values as a firm, as you well know, is excellence. So when we're screening talent, we don't necessarily want somebody to say like, do you value excellence? Of course, somebody's going to say yes to that. But the way that we'll ask it instead is, Tell me about where you've demonstrated excellence in your life. And it doesn't have to be through the lens of the advisory work that we do. I've had really rich conversations with candidates who are excellent at cooking, or who are excellent in a particular sport, or who are excellent spellers. I've had that conversation. And it almost doesn't matter what it is. What we're really trying to define is like, how do you actually define excellence? How do you measure excellence? How do you know if how do you observe and perceive and evaluate excellence? Like that gives me an indication of, is there a predisposition for that kind of shared value? People may express it differently, but is the core essence similar?
Yeah, it's a little bit too about our show me test. When we,
Mm-hmm.
as a firm, will have an individual who's interviewing do a show me test, whatever that is for their field, what that looks like, either from an EA or from a consultant or an MD. We have them show them. So if excellence is a value, that would also come out through the conversation in what they do. Do they show whatever it is that they do with excellence, which makes sense. I
Yeah.
guess
Can they demonstrate it?
going back to the finding it within people, starting back with the external rather than the internal, going back to the who do I admire, and then can I pull down from that person? Have you done that exercise? Have you looked at somebody and say, okay, I admire this person. Where are my values? I mean, how do we make it very practical for people to say, this is who I admire, this is what I value? That was one of the themes that we had from several questions that came through.
Yeah. Yeah, one nuance that I think I start with is I don't ask the question, who do I value, as much as I ask the question, what is it about this person that I value? Because I may not, or admire. I may not admire the whole person. There are very few leaders that I think are, perfect. Well, I don't think any leaders are perfect by any means. But if you get caught in the who, then it becomes part of like the personality, or you feel like it's got to be all or nothing, versus like, what are the attributes that I most admire in this person? And I've worked around a number of leaders, not just in an advisory capacity, but when I was in more of a corporate context. Everybody's got their strengths and everybody's got their opportunities. So I think about it as like collecting points of reference. I might admire this person because they're a really good presenter and they're able to take complex ideas and translate them into very simple, understandable language. I might admire this person for the rigor in their own personal routines and how they manage their time and their energy. I might admire this person because they're great at making people feel good and seen and included in a process. And pretty much everybody's got something you can admire. So I think about it as like not a person as much as it is pieces and parts of lots of people. To me, I found that to be much more practical and helpful in sort of reflecting on my own values, that it's not like I'm trying to emulate somebody else. This is a something that they do specifically. That's the other thing about observing or admiring other people, is it forces a degree of kind of specificity and behavior, as opposed to just I admire integrity. It's like, no, I admire the way that this person makes decisions in alignment with company values. Like that's a real expression of integrity. So I think observing it in others is also a great way to make it a little bit more clear, a little bit more specific, and actually translate it into a behavior, not just an idea.
Yeah. What I really like, there's two elements of that you said. One of them was, okay, now we can make it more actionable. But we had that question around, one of the questions that came in is, how do I not put somebody on a pedestal? Right? How do I do this in a way that doesn't have them be a superhero or pedestal them? And so you really broke down it's not really the person holistically, but just what is it about them, which makes it much more, I think, almost digestible too, because you're not going to like everything about your leader, but you can find something.
Yeah.
We also hit on that a bit when we talk about fanness, and when we're thinking about how can I be a fan of somebody? It's that same feel of you can find something. So I think it's interesting to say, when you pulled it down about values, okay, you can find something in this person too that has an element of a value you admire. The distinction to help you find your values would be that first gut. Okay, I really admire this about someone. Okay, why? And that makes it real and tangible. Speaking of questions, I do want to give everybody a chance in the webinar chat. If the benefit of joining these is to be able to ask those live questions. So if you want to ask some questions of Ben, please go ahead and add some more there. And then I'll pull back down some of the ones that we have already previously been asked as well. One of the big areas that was asked was that idea of, okay, well, as I'm thinking through making this real, how can I take them and help other people make decisions based on, or help me and other people make decisions based on them? We've lightly hit on them on that idea, but Ben, maybe you could elaborate based on that question of how do I take my value that I've defined and have it make a decision or articulate it when I'm trying to make a decision?
Yeah, it's a great question. And certainly it's a bit contextual, but one thing I like to do is based on, values that I believe are particularly important for me, ask myself the question, how does this actually, one, is this evident in currently in the decisions I'm making? And that can be everything from where I spend my time, what I fund, who I hire or promote, clients that I choose to work with or not work with. All of those things are sort of actual manifestations of kind of our day-to-day decision making. So sort of looking at, so like if I say that, so one of mine, without being too revealing, but one of my primary values is fairness. So one of the things that I like to say is, okay, well, what does that actually mean? How does that show up on my day-to-day routines? Well, it'll show up in terms of who I invite to meetings. It'll show up in terms of who gets what airtime in terms of the conversation. It'll show up in terms of how I give feedback. It'll show up in terms of when and how I convene groups of people. That's just a small example, but if you sort of push yourself to like peel back the layers of what does this value actually look like in practice, and then you can sort of reflect that back and say, am I displaying it that way? Could I display it differently or better? But that's going to look different depending on what the value is and the context in which you're trying to apply that value. Like another one that I think about is like, it's really important to me that I teach judgment, right? Not that I just give people an answer, but I help people think through a solution. So one of the ways that shows up in my routines is I never redline anything, or I never sort of give people the answer. I say, here are some things I would think about, or when you take a next pass at this, dial up the language in this area, see if you can underscore this point. So people still have to apply and use their own judgment, and that's kind of how they learn that process without me just sort of either giving them the answer or leading them to a conclusion. So I think there's probably parallels depending on what your value is, like how does it actually show up day to day, but sort of pushing yourself to make that determination. And then that also helps you sort of, as a barometer, keep yourself honest and say, like, am I actually displaying this? If I've said this is important to me, and I believe it's important to me, would somebody else be able to observe that and say, yeah, that's important to you?
Absolutely. We have, of course, with 5 minutes left, so quite a few questions have come in. One of the big ones, I'm going to hit on Danielle's, which overlaps. It says, what do you think about humility as a core value? It sounds like it's actually a virtue. And so I'm going to double down on the definition between the two so we can get clear on that. But realistically, if anybody wants to schedule a quick 10-minute call with a coach to say, hey, I want to make sure I'm really aligned with my values and that I can get to articulate how I feel about them, Sophie's going to give us a link to make sure that you can get those 10 minutes. We could also take that from a team perspective. What are my team's values? Can we articulate them and then use that as a guiding force? So values, I just want to put that line in the sand, are that compass points. Those are things that you value, like transparency, excellence, relationships. That's a guiding principle, compass that I'm working towards. Our virtue is more like those moral qualities that I think we are looking at, such as the courage, honesty. I would probably put humility. Ben, where would you throw? I'm almost thinking more of that virtue
Yeah.
statement. Honesty.
I mean, yeah, not to get too clinical about it, but I feel like humility is a virtue, but the value around that would be the expression of that in terms of a value might actually be. I was just having a coaching conversation earlier today with a leader who is looking to get better at putting their team of subject matter experts out front and not feeling like they have to be the voice of the answer, because they've gotten so used to building their own credibility by being expert, that now they have to actually redefine humility through their own lens to say, like, okay, now my job actually isn't to show my expertise. My job is actually to cultivate expertise on the team and actually put that expertise forward in lieu of my own visibility and presence. So to me, it's like, as a leader, I might value humility, but like pushing for what does the specific expression of that actually look like? And that's when I think you can get more actionable.
Yeah. I like Taryn's question in there, which is similar to where you're headed. But how do you encourage upcoming leaders to articulate what they admire in others and use that to shape their leadership voice? My short answer is, I'll take a stab first if you want to think of it.
Yeah.
My short answer is this comes out a lot in coaching. So if you're coaching either as the manager or coaching as a coach, asking the question, who is it that you admire on this topic in this area, getting really detailed about it. Hey, I'm trying to get feedback. This is a tricky topic. I've been given feedback on it before. What did somebody do that helped you? What is where they showed up for you in this conversation? How did they present? Helping to get them to think through it a bit more too and articulate what they admired in others to get to it. Ben, what do you want to add?
Yeah, a question I love to use in that regard, if somebody's trying to solve a problem, is to be able to say, who have you seen do it really well? It's another way of sort of asking without being like, who do you admire? You can actually, if somebody's struggling with something, saying, who do you look up to in this particular area, or who have you seen do it really well that you might be able to learn from or emulate.
I think the key there too is keeping it positive. Whereas if you let somebody go down that path of like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to show up this way, I don't want to, then we take that down the negative. And the whole essence of this field note is let's keep it on that very positive, value-driven approach of who we can put a stake in the ground of, yes, I want to do it that way, rather than I don't want to have this, or I don't want to show up this way, or I don't want these values. There are a few other questions in the chat. We are really right at time. So just to recap on a couple of the things we talked about, we really talked about reflecting on who you admire and therefore pulling those specific values, making sure that we're thinking about our decisions and actions and can we align them. Of course, that team element. And then obviously adding in, how do we bring people in, think about teams and broader. So I do want to thank you all. Thank you for the questions that came flooding in towards the end. There was a lot of conversation that we really left untouched. So schedule a time with a coach. Obviously ask Alex. Alex has a lot of great input and ideas here as well. And if anything else comes up, let us know. Thank you for your time. And Ben, thank you for your time.
Thank you.